In the winter of 1939, the hum of machines began to replace the quiet of peace. Across oceans, governments and generals prepared for a storm that would consume the world. Yet no one could foresee that the war's most decisive weapon would not be a bomb or a bullet, but a workforce that had never before been allowed near the front lines. When the first factories fell silent in Europe, darkness covered the continent. Hitler's armies moved with mechanical precision, and industry was enslaved for war. Britain, isolated and outnumbered, turned every brick mill and shipyard into a weapon of survival. The Ministry of Labor sent out its call. Every able hand was needed. By September 1939, the first British women entered munitions works in Coventry and Birmingham. They were teachers, clerks, mothers, now transformed into engineers. When the Luftwaffe bombed London in December 1940, those same women stood under the orange sky, returned to the night shift, and kept the belts running. The smell of oil mixed with the acrid dust of bombed cities. For them, there was no front line and no retreat. In March 1941, the British government issued the Essential Work Order. Every factory, from Vickers to the Royal Ordnance, became a fortress of production. The law made it a crime to leave war work without permission. The faces inside those walls were young, often pale, lit by the flicker of welding arcs. Women built Spitfire wings in Castle Bromwich, hammered shells in Woolwich, and packed explosives under the dull echo of air raid sirens. That same year, across the Atlantic, America still stood at peace, watching, waiting. But its industries were already shifting. The gears of Detroit turned slower than before, but change was in motion. In April 1941, construction began on a colossal new plant outside Ypsilanti, Michigan. It was called Willow Run, a 67-acre cathedral of steel and glass designed to build a single aircraft, the B-24 Liberator. Ford Motor Company, master of the automobile assembly line, would attempt something no one had done before: mass-produce a heavy bomber. When Roosevelt declared war on December 8, 1941, the quiet hum of Detroit became a roar. The United States had entered the war, and its factories became its army. On January 16, 1942, the president signed an executive order creating the War Production Board. The nation's car plants were ordered to stop building cars. From that moment, no new automobile would leave an American factory for nearly 4 years. Ford's engineers dismantled their peacetime world in weeks. Machine tools were torn from the floors, stamping presses retooled, furnaces recalibrated. Every screw, every die, every mold was repurposed for war. At Willow Run, assembly lines stretched a mile long. Each hour, a new bomber would roll toward the sunlight, its aluminum skin polished by hands that had once sewn dresses or typed letters. Those hands belonged to women. They came from every state, some leaving behind children and farms, others answering an invisible call that crossed the radio waves. By mid-1942, the first women began training at Ford's River Rouge complex. They learned to rivet, weld, and inspect engines built for destruction. Inside the cavernous halls, the rhythmic clang of their tools became the pulse of a new America. By 1943, 1 out of every 3 workers at Willow Run was a woman. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. Under the steel rafters, they worked through heat, fatigue, and the ever-present noise of machines that never stopped. They riveted bomber wings, aligned fuselages, and sealed the engines that would soon cross oceans. In May 1943, the image that would come to define them appeared on magazine racks across the country. Norman Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter, a strong, armed woman resting between shifts, a lunchbox at her side, captured the spirit of millions. Yet the real Rosies weren't resting. They were working 12-hour days, covered in dust and oil, building the planes that would blacken the skies over Europe. Meanwhile, in Britain, women's labor had become the nation's backbone. By 1943, 7 million British women were serving the war, half of them in factories. The air raids never stopped, but neither did production. At the Rolls-Royce plant in Derby, women assembled the Merlin engines that powered Spitfires and Lancasters. In Scotland's shipyards, they welded hulls in freezing winds. Posters plastered across London streets read, "Women of Britain, come into the factories." The United Kingdom had conscripted women into war work, the first nation in history to do so. From December 1941 onward, single women aged 20 to 30 were required by law to serve. Some drove trucks, others worked as clerks or radar operators, but thousands chose the factories. They worked in conditions that blurred the line between endurance and sacrifice. TNT dust burned their skin yellow. Factory floors trembled under constant noise, and the hours stretched endlessly. But when Spitfires rose over the channel, they knew what their work had meant. Across the Eastern Front, a different kind of labor war was unfolding. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the Red Army called every man to arms and every woman to labor. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded on trains, and moved thousands of kilometers east beyond the Ural Mountains. In the frozen city of Chelyabinsk, those factories were rebuilt piece by piece. It was called Tankragad, the city of tanks. There, in the biting cold, Soviet women took over the machines. They welded the hulls of T-34 tanks, turned the wheels of artillery lathes, and assembled weapons under flickering lamps. By 1942, more than half of the Soviet Union's industrial workers were women. The propaganda posters showed them smiling, sleeves rolled up, promising victory. The reality was brutal. They lived in dormitories without heat, worked 16-hour shifts, and sometimes buried their own children in the snow outside the plant gates. But the tanks they built rolled westward and never stopped. By 1943, as the Battle of Stalingrad turned the tide of the war, Soviet production surged. The Red Army's tanks, planes, and artillery, many built by women, overwhelmed the German front. Soviet factories operated even under bombing and starvation. Every shell and engine carried fingerprints of the women who refused to stop working. Across continents, the same pattern echoed. Factories once designed for peace now pulsed with the power of necessity. Steel and sweat became the twin currencies of survival. By late 1943, America's industrial heartland had become a landscape of smoke and flame. The Ford plant at Willow Run now produced a B-24 every 63 minutes. Conveyor belts carried wings over the heads of thousands of workers, the sound of drills blending into a steady thunder. Planes emerged from the assembly lines like clockwork, metal giants ready for the skies. Each one bore the mark of hands unseen by history, women whose names were never recorded, but whose labor shaped the war's outcome. In the shipyards of California, in the munitions plants of Leeds, in the icy furnaces of the Urals, they built the machines that would decide the fate of nations. The battlefields of the world depended on them, though they never carried rifles or medals. They worked in silence, beneath floodlights and factory dust, turning raw metal into the engines of freedom. And as the war reached its height in 1944, that silence was about to break. By the dawn of 1944, the hum of wartime industry had become the heartbeat of the world. Across 3 continents, the rhythm was the same: presses hammering steel, welders bending light into metal, engines roaring to life. The women who once stepped into these factories as replacements were now the masters of them. At Willow Run, the assembly lines never slept. The plant stretched farther than the eye could see, its windows glowing through the Michigan night. Each B-24 Liberator was a miracle of coordination. Hundreds of thousands of parts assembled by hands that moved with absolute precision. Women stood shoulder to shoulder along the line, tightening bolts, inspecting fuselages, checking gauges by touch more than sight. Their skill had outgrown the word temporary. They were professionals now, though history still called them Rosies. By late 1944, Willow Run was producing more than 650 bombers a month, and Ford engineers calculated that one plane left the line every 63 minutes. The scale of it defied imagination. From the air, the plant resembled a living machine. Smoke, motion, noise. Inside, the temperature rose above 90 degrees. The air was thick with the smell of oil and aluminum dust. Yet the workers pressed on, knowing every aircraft carried men who would not return if they failed. Elsewhere, the same transformation played out. In Baltimore's shipyards, women welded Liberty ships under the glow of sparks that fell like rain. In Pittsburgh's steel mills, they poured molten metal into molds for tank treads. In California, at the Douglas aircraft plant, nearly half the workforce was female. Their faces were streaked with grime, their overalls burnt and torn, but they were reshaping the meaning of labor itself. By that same year, the number of women in the U.S. labor force had risen from 12 million to more than 19 million. In just 3 years, they had entered every industry, from aviation to electronics. They weren't simply replacing men, they were redefining efficiency. Studies showed that women performed some precision tasks more accurately than their male predecessors, but their pay still lagged far behind, an unspoken contradiction in a nation preaching equality on the battlefield. Across the Atlantic, Britain was fighting exhaustion. The war had stretched into its 5th year. Cities were still rebuilding from the Blitz, and families were fractured by years of loss. Yet inside the nation's factories, the momentum never stopped. By 1944, nearly 90% of single British women and 80% of married women were engaged in some form of national service, uniformed or industrial. They built tanks at Birmingham, filled shells in Leeds, and assembled aircraft in shadowed hangars across Lancashire. The British called them munitionettes. They wore scarves and overalls, their skin stained yellow by TNT powder. They lived in hostels near the factories, worked 12-hour shifts, and returned home through blackout streets. In government reports, they were numbers, 7 million women in war industries. But in reality, they were the pulse that kept the island alive. The government's propaganda captured their image in bold colors. Every woman not doing vital work is needed now. Posters, films, and radio broadcasts turned industrial labor into patriotism. By D-Day, Britain's women had manufactured millions of shells, thousands of bombers, and nearly every piece of the invasion's machinery. When Allied troops landed on Normandy's beaches in June 1944, every rifle, tank, and engine bore the imprint of unseen hands. The landings were not just a triumph of strategy. They were a victory of production. The supply lines that stretched across oceans had been built by women in coveralls who would never see those beaches. Far to the east, the Soviet Union had turned its suffering into sheer momentum. At Chelyabinsk's Tankograd, night and day no longer existed, only shifts. Women worked under floodlights, assembling the T-34, the machine that had become the backbone of the Red Army. In 1933 alone, the Soviet Union built more than 24,000 tanks and 35,000 aircraft, most of them under the supervision of female workers. They labored in unimaginable conditions. Coal for heating was scarce, food rationed to near starvation, and the temperature in winter dropped below -30 degrees. Yet the machines kept coming. In propaganda reels, Soviet women smiled at the camera, hair covered in scarves, eyes bright with determination. Off camera, they shared bread crusts in silence and slept beside the furnaces. When the Red Army broke through at Kursk and pushed westward, it did so on steel forged by these women. By late 1944, more than half of all Soviet industrial laborers were female, the highest proportion in the world. For many, war work was not a choice, but survival. Husbands, fathers, and sons had vanished to the front. The factories were all that remained. As 1945 approached, the war reached its brutal crescendo. In America, production reached heights never seen before or since. 296,000 aircraft, 87,000 tanks, and over 2 million vehicles had been built by war's end. Behind each number was a factory floor alive with movement, women shaping, soldering, lifting. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. For the first time in years, the machines began to slow. Assembly lines still moved, but their purpose had shifted. Factories that once built bombers were asked to produce washing machines and cars. The silence after the final whistle was deafening. The end of war brought a strange mixture of triumph and loss. Newspapers celebrated victory, politicians praised the home front. But within months, the same posters that had once pleaded, "We can do it," were replaced by new messages, "Welcome the men home." In Detroit, layoffs swept through the plants. Returning soldiers reclaimed their jobs, and women were told their duty was done. The same nation that had called them heroes now asked them to go home. By the winter of 1945, the number of women in U.S. factories had dropped by nearly half. Many left willingly. Others were pushed out. A government survey showed that 3 out of 4 women wanted to keep working. But the old rules returned quietly, as if the war had never happened. In Britain, the demobilization orders arrived just as swiftly. The war's end brought rationing, rebuilding, and a longing for normal life. Women were released from essential work, their contracts terminated. By 1946, only a fraction remained in the jobs they had mastered. The same government that had conscripted them now encouraged them to resume home duties. In the Soviet Union, things unfolded differently. The Red Army's victory came at an unspeakable cost. Tens of millions dead, many of them men. There were not enough workers left to rebuild without women. The Soviet state called upon them again, not as a wartime measure, but as a permanent necessity. They rebuilt factories, cities, and railways. They returned to the same machines, this time producing tractors instead of tanks. By the late 1940s, the echoes of war still lingered in every foundry and shipyard. The world had been rebuilt on the foundation women had laid. Their work had altered economies, challenged prejudice, and proven that industry had no gender. Yet history, as always, was slowed to remember them. The rosy posters faded. The munition plants were dismantled. In time, their uniforms disappeared into closets and photographs. The women who built the war became mothers, teachers, and clerks again. But the legacy of what they had done remained. Every new generation of workers, every engineer, every mechanic owes something to that moment in history when women took control of the machines of war and mastered them. They had built the bombers that darkened the skies over Germany, the tanks that broke the Nazi line, the ships that crossed the Atlantic. Without them, there would have been no invasion, no liberation, no victory. In 1945, the world celebrated peace. But in truth, peace had been forged not only by generals and soldiers, but by millions of anonymous hands. Hands that riveted steel, fueled furnaces, and turned tools until their palms bled. They never asked for glory. They never expected monuments. They simply worked. And in doing so, they changed the course of history. Today, in the quiet corners of old factories, some of their machines still stand, rusted, silent, and covered in dust. And though history may remember the generals and the battles, it was the women in the factories, unseen, unnamed, unstoppable,
who kept the world alive when everything else was falling apart.